What if I told you that the most powerful economic weapon ever used against a country wasn't a missile, wasn't a sanction, wasn't even a tariff, but a single piece of paper signed inside a fancy hotel in New York City? And what if I told you that the exact same weapon is being prepared right now, and China has been quietly getting ready for it for the past 3 years, moving hundreds of billions of dollars in a slow, silent escape that most people have not even noticed? Think about this for a second. One meeting, 5 men in suits, a few signatures, and a country that was on the verge of becoming the biggest economy on Earth was frozen in place for the next 30 years. That is not a movie plot. That is real history. And what is happening today between America and China might be the sequel nobody wants to talk about. Before I take you deeper into this story, do me one small favor. If you care about money, power, and the games global superpowers play behind closed doors, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with one person who still believes the global economy is just about numbers on a screen. Because after today, you will see it very differently. Now let us go back to the 1980s. Picture Japan at that time. It was not the quiet, aging country you might think of today. Japan in the 1980s was a machine, a roaring, unstoppable economic machine. Japanese cars were flooding American streets. Japanese televisions were sitting in almost every American living room. Sony, Panasonic, Toyota, Honda, Nissan. These names were everywhere. And they were not just selling cheap products. They were selling better products at lower prices. That is a nightmare combination for any competitor. American factories were shutting down one after another. American workers were watching their jobs disappear across the Pacific Ocean. Detroit, once the proud capital of the car industry, was slowly bleeding out. And meanwhile, Japan was rolling in cash. So much cash that Japanese investors started buying pieces of America itself. They bought Rockefeller Center in the middle of Manhattan. They bought Columbia Pictures, one of Hollywood's biggest studios. They bought Pebble Beach, the legendary golf course in California. It felt like Japan was not just competing with America, it was buying it. At the same time, Japan had become America's biggest lender. When you buy things from another country, you send them dollars. Japan had so many dollars from selling to America that it started using them to buy American government debt. By the mid-1980s, Japan was holding more American debt than any other country in the world. Think about how strange that sounds. The country that had lost World War II just 40 years earlier was now America's banker. Japan's economy was catching up so fast that experts were writing books predicting Japan would pass America. Imagine being in Washington and watching this happen. You are the most powerful country on earth, but your factories are dying, your workers are angry, and the country beating you is also the country lending you money. Something had to give. And in Washington, the pressure to act was crushing. But here is where the story gets interesting. Because America did not respond with tariffs. It did not respond with sanctions. It did not start a trade war. It did something much smarter, much quieter, much more dangerous. On the 22nd of September, 1985, 5 men walked into the Plaza Hotel in New York City. They were the finance ministers and central bank leaders of the 5 biggest economies on earth at that time. America, Japan, West Germany, France, Britain. They sat in a room, they talked, and by the end of that meeting, they signed a document. That document is now called the Plaza Accord. And that piece of paper is the reason Japan spent the next 3 decades stuck in slow motion. Here's what the Plaza Accord actually did. It was an agreement to make the American dollar weaker on purpose. Yes, on purpose. America wanted its own currency to fall in value. Why? Because if the dollar is weaker, American products become cheaper for other countries to buy. And Japanese products, made in yen, suddenly become much more expensive. It was a currency trick. But it was one of the most powerful currency tricks ever pulled off in history. And Japan agreed to it, sitting right there at the table. You might be asking, why on earth would Japan agree to something that would hurt its own economy? The answer is pressure, political pressure, diplomatic pressure. Japan was still under the American security umbrella. Japan needed America as a friend, not an enemy. Japan believed that agreeing to a small compromise would keep the relationship healthy. Japan thought this was a partnership. What Japan did not understand was that partnerships between unequal powers are never really partnerships. They are polite arrangements until they are not. Before the Plaza Accord, 1 American dollar was worth around 240 Japanese yen. Just 18 months later, $1 bought only 120 yen. The yen had doubled in value. Doubled. In a year and a half. Let me put that in plain words for you. Imagine you run a company in Japan that sells a car in America for $10,000. Before the Accord, you get about 2.4 million yen back. Suddenly, the same $10,000 gives you only 1.2 million yen. Overnight, your business is losing half its money, not because you did anything wrong, not because your product got worse, just because 5 men signed a piece of paper. The whole Japanese export machine, the engine that had powered the country's rise for 40 years, started to grind. Factories struggled. Profits shrank. Companies had to make painful choices. Some moved production overseas, some cut jobs, some just absorbed the losses and hoped for a miracle. And this is when Japan made the second mistake, the one that turned a bad situation into a generational disaster. The Japanese government panicked. They saw the economy slowing down and they decided to flood the country with cheap money. The Bank of Japan cut interest rates hard. Suddenly, borrowing money was almost free. Any business could get a loan. Any person could get a mortgage. Any bank could lend without much worry. It felt like a party. And for a few years, it really was. But here's the thing about cheap money. It does not just stay quiet. It rushes into places where it can grow fast. And in Japan, it rushed into land and stocks. Real estate prices in Tokyo went completely insane. At the peak of the madness, the land under the Imperial Palace in central Tokyo was worth more on paper than all the real estate in the entire state of California. Read that again. A single palace ground more valuable than millions of homes across an American state. The Nikkei stock market tripled in just a few years. Japanese banks were lending money against these crazy prices. Japanese companies were borrowing against these crazy prices. And with all that money, they went shopping around the world. That is when the Rockefeller Center deal happened. That is when Columbia Pictures got sold. That is when Pebble Beach changed hands. It looked like Japanese power. It was actually a currency bubble that had been forced open by a hotel meeting in Manhattan. And then, as all bubbles do, it popped. In 1989, the Bank of Japan finally realized things had gone too far. So they started raising interest rates. 5 hikes in 12 months. The cheap money that had blown up the bubble was suddenly pulled out, and the whole thing collapsed. The Nikkei dropped 60% in 3 years. Land prices fell by 70%. Banks were sitting on mountains of loans that would never be paid back. Companies that looked rich on paper were actually broken. And the Japanese government, instead of doing the painful thing and letting the bad parts of the economy die, chose to protect everything. To hide the damage. To keep zombie banks alive with government money. To keep zombie companies alive with zombie bank loans. Interest rates were pushed close to zero and kept there for decades. The result was slow suffocation, not a sharp collapse, not a dramatic depression, just a long, quiet, endless stagnation. Prices stopped rising, wages stopped rising. Young people stopped believing the future would be better than the past. The Nikkei only returned to its 1989 peak in the year 2024. Think about that. 35 years to get back to where you started. An entire generation of Japanese workers lived their whole careers inside a frozen economy. They never knew the growth their parents had lived through. Pause here for a moment. Let that sink in. Because everything I just told you is not just history. It is the blueprint. And China has been reading that blueprint every single day for the past 40 years. Quick pause. I know this is heavy. I know your brain is probably already connecting dots that most people never see. If this video is genuinely opening your eyes to something, do not scroll past it. Tap that like button. Drop a quick comment with just one word that describes how you feel right now, and hit subscribe if you want to see the world of money the way real strategists see it. Because the second half of this story is where it gets really personal for anyone holding dollars, savings, or debt right now. Now let us talk about China, because to understand what is happening today, you have to understand how China ended up in almost the same position Japan was in during the 1980s, but with one massive difference. China has been watching. China has been learning. And China has spent years preparing an escape that Japan never even thought about. China started climbing the same ladder Japan climbed. Cheap manufacturing. Massive exports. Huge trade surpluses with America. American consumers loved Chinese products. And China loved American dollars in return. Just like Japan, China started collecting those dollars. And just like Japan, China had to put those dollars somewhere safe. The safest place in the world for dollars, at least on paper, is American government debt. So China started buying American Treasury bonds by the truckload. By 2013, China was holding $1.3 trillion in American debt. $1.3 trillion. That is a number so big it does not even feel real. China had become America's biggest lender. And in that moment, China looked exactly like Japan in 1985. A rising economic giant, a massive trade surplus, a mountain of American debt, and a growing American political anger about jobs, factories, and unfair competition. If you were paying attention, you could feel the story about to repeat itself. And so could China. In fact, Chinese economists, Chinese policymakers, Chinese leaders had studied the Plaza Accord for decades. It was almost a horror story taught in Chinese universities. The lesson was simple and sharp. Never trust a partnership when the other side controls the rules of the game. Never let your economic future depend on the goodwill of another country. Never hold so much of another nation's debt that they can squeeze you whenever they want. So around 3 years ago, something very quiet started happening. China began selling. Not dumping, not panicking, not making headlines, just selling. Steadily, carefully. Almost like a person slowly walking out of a burning building without wanting anyone to notice. From $1.3 trillion in American debt, China's holdings dropped to about $800 billion. That is $500 billion gone, sold off piece by piece, and the pace has been getting faster, not slower. Now, here is the part that most people miss. China is not trying to crash the American dollar. That would be a disaster for China too. Because if the dollar collapses, the remaining $800 billion China holds becomes worthless. And even worse, China still sells huge amounts of goods to America. If Americans cannot afford to buy anything, China's own factories start shaking. So crashing the system is not the plan. Escaping the system is the plan. At the same time, China has been selling American debt. It has been quietly doing 3 other things. First, China has been buying gold. Not a little bit, not a normal amount, record-breaking amounts. In just the past 2 years, China's central bank has added more than 1,000 tons. Gold is a currency that no country controls. Gold cannot be frozen by Washington. Gold cannot be sanctioned. Gold does not care about interest rates or trade deals. When a country stockpiles gold at this speed, it is not decorating a vault. It is preparing for a world where the dollar is no longer the only safe place to store value. Second, China has been building trade deals in its own currency, the yuan. Deals with Russia, deals with Saudi Arabia, deals with Brazil, deals with countries across Africa and Southeast Asia. Slowly, quietly, more oil, more raw materials, more goods are being paid for in yuan instead of dollars. Every single one of those trades is a small crack in the wall of dollar power. And China has been laying those cracks patiently year after year. Third, China has been diversifying into other currencies and other assets, euros, yen, even smaller currencies, and investments in real projects around the world, roads, ports, factories. All of this shifts wealth out of paper American promises and into real things that produce real value. Now, look at the difference between Japan in 1985 and China today. Japan was standing in front of the door when America locked it. China has been slowly opening a window on the other side of the house for years. Japan did not know the trap was coming until it was already inside. China knew from the very first day that the trap existed, and it built its life around avoiding it. But this raises a huge question. What happens to America if China succeeds in walking out of the dollar system? What happens to America if others start following China's example? Because remember, China is not the only country holding massive amounts of American debt. Japan itself, after all these decades, is still one of the biggest holders. Japan currently holds around $1.1 trillion in American bonds. Yes, more than China does today. And here is where the story gets even more interesting. Japan's economy has finally, after 35 years, started to wake up. Prices are rising again. Wages are moving. The Bank of Japan is slowly, cautiously raising interest rates. This is a small event to most people, but for the global financial system, it is a massive shift. Because as long as Japanese interest rates were near zero, Japanese investors had no choice. They had to put their money in American bonds where they could actually earn something. But as Japanese rates rise, Japanese investors suddenly have a good reason to bring that money home. Think about it. If you are a Japanese pension fund, you can now earn a decent return inside Japan. Why would you keep taking currency risk by holding American bonds? You would not. Slowly, that money starts flowing back home. And if Japan begins selling American debt seriously, it could easily be bigger than what China has been doing. This is the second earthquake starting to shake under America's feet, and most people are not talking about it yet. Let me hit pause on the analysis for a moment and talk to you honestly. If you're still here, still watching, still following every twist of this story, I want you to know something. This is not just a video about numbers. This is a video about your future, about the money in your bank account, about the price of the home you live in, about the interest rate on the credit card in your pocket. If this is helping you, I have a small request. Instead of just liking this video, share it in one place, one group chat, one friend, one family member. That is how we push real information past the noise. And of course, subscribe. It is free, and it means the world to a channel like this. Now let us go back to the storm building over America. Because here is the harsh reality that few people want to say out loud. America needs foreign buyers. It really, really needs them. Every single year, the American government has to sell about $2 trillion in new bonds. $2 trillion. Not to build new things, not to invest in the future. Mostly just to pay off old debts that are coming due and to cover the money the government spends but does not collect in taxes. For decades, foreign buyers like Japan, China, and other countries have quietly bought a huge portion of those bonds. That foreign demand has kept American interest rates lower than they should be. It has let America borrow cheaply, It has let the American government spend beyond its means without immediate pain. But if that foreign demand starts drying up, everything changes. Think of American debt like a giant party where America keeps ordering more food. For years, foreign countries have been paying most of the bill without complaining. But now, one by one, some of the biggest guests are quietly walking out of the room. If they leave, the remaining people at the table have to cover the cost. And the only way America can convince them to keep buying is to offer higher interest rates, higher yields, more attractive returns. And that is where the real damage begins. Higher interest rates on Treasury bonds do not just affect the government. They ripple through the entire American economy. Mortgage rates go up. Car loans get more expensive. Credit card interest climbs. Small businesses pay more to borrow. Big businesses pay more to expand. Home buyers get pushed out of the market. Economic growth slows down. And most importantly, the American government itself has to pay more interest on the giant pile of debt it already owes. Right now, America has around $36 trillion in debt. Just 10 years ago, the interest America paid on its debt was around $350 billion a year. Today, that number is more than $1 trillion a year. Yes, $1 trillion, every single year, just in interest payments, and that number keeps climbing. If foreign demand weakens further, that interest bill grows even more, and here is where the ugly loop begins. To pay the higher interest, America has to borrow more money. To borrow more money, it has to sell more bonds. To sell more bonds, it needs buyers. If foreign buyers keep stepping back, America has to raise rates again to attract them. Higher rates mean higher interest costs. Higher interest costs mean even more borrowing. It is a snake eating its own tail, and nobody in Washington has a clear plan to break the cycle. Now bring back the Japan comparison. Japan, in 1985, had about $200 billion in American debt and no exit strategy. Japan trusted the system. Japan trusted the friendship. Japan believed that being polite and cooperative would keep it safe. When the Plaza Accord came, Japan was completely exposed. It had no plan B, no gold stockpile, no alternative currency network, no political willingness to say no, so it signed. And it paid the price for the next 35 years. China has been building a plan B. $800 billion in American debt is a lot, but it is not a leash, the way $1.3 trillion used to be. Every year, that number shrinks. Every year, more gold is added. Every year, more trade is settled in yuan. Every year, the distance between China's economy and America's leverage grows a little wider. So the real question is not whether America can pull off another Plaza Accord. The real question is whether it has already lost the ability to do so. Imagine trying to force China into an agreement like the one Japan signed. Imagine calling that same meeting today. Would China come to the table under American pressure the way Japan did in 1985? Would China agree to weaken the dollar and strengthen the yuan on America's terms? Very unlikely, because China has already been strengthening the yuan on its own terms, slowly, for years, and it has built up enough independence that Washington's threats no longer carry the same weight. But here's the tension. America still has huge financial power. It still controls the global banking network. It still controls the dollar payment system that most countries use every day. It still has the ability to freeze assets, block transactions, and cut countries off from the modern financial world. And we saw that when Russia was hit with sanctions. We saw entire piles of Russian dollar reserves get frozen almost instantly. That moment was a wake-up call, not just for Russia, but for every country holding large amounts of American debt. Because if the American government can freeze Russian dollars, it can freeze anyone's dollars. And if it can freeze anyone's dollars, then those dollars are not really yours. You just hold them until Washington decides you can. That single realization has changed how central banks around the world think about their reserves. It is one of the reasons gold buying by central banks has hit record highs. It is one of the reasons yuan trade deals have exploded. It is one of the reasons the Plaza Accord playbook may never work again. But America might not need the same playbook. It might try a new one. And this is where things get scary. Because if America cannot force China into a currency deal, and if America cannot control foreign buyers of its debt, then it has fewer and fewer polite tools to keep the system running. What is left when the polite tools run out? Louder tools, harder tools, tariffs, sanctions, restrictions, trade fights, political pressure, financial isolation attempts. We are already seeing early versions of these in the headlines every week, and they are only getting louder. Now let us think about the ordinary person in all this, because you might be watching this and thinking, okay, this is fascinating, but what does any of this have to do with me? Everything. It has everything to do with you. If foreign countries stop buying American bonds, interest rates go up. That affects your mortgage, your rent, your student loans, your credit card bill, your car payment. If the American government keeps borrowing more just to pay interest, taxes will eventually have to rise, or public services will have to be cut. That affects your paycheck. If the dollar starts losing its position as the world's main currency, prices for imported goods rise. That affects your groceries, your electronics, your fuel, and almost everything in your home. The story of Japan is not just about faraway rich men signing papers in fancy hotels. The story of Japan is about how quickly an entire country's future can shift. The story of China is not just about geopolitics. It is about how a country can quietly prepare for a storm that others refuse to see coming. The question for us, as ordinary people, is simple. Are we watching, or are we sleepwalking? All right, one more time, I have to ask you something. If you have made it this far, you are not a casual viewer. You're someone who actually thinks, someone who wants to understand the world instead of just reacting to headlines. Tell me what you think will happen. Do you believe China will successfully escape the dollar trap, or will America find a new way to squeeze it, just like it squeezed Japan? Your comment could be the one that starts the smartest conversation in this entire community. Now let us zoom out and look at the bigger picture. History almost never repeats itself in the exact same way. It rhymes. Japan and China are not identical stories. Japan was politically dependent on America. Japan was under American military protection. Japan had a smaller population and a very cooperative culture toward its ally. Japan needed America more than America needed Japan. That is why the Plaza Accord worked so cleanly. That is why Japan signed and did not fight back. China is different in almost every way. China is not under American military protection. China has its own nuclear weapons, its own massive army, its own regional power bloc. China has 1.4 billion people. China is not just an exporter to America. It is also increasingly an importer, a producer, a lender, and a strategic rival. That means the tools that worked on Japan may not work on China. And if they do not work, America has to invent something new. And whatever it invents will change the global economy in ways we cannot fully predict. That is the danger, and that is the drama we are living through right now. It is not a movie. It is not a theory. It is happening in real time. Every quarter, Chinese Treasury holdings shrink a little more. Every year, central banks buy more gold. Every month, another country signs another deal in yuan, or euros, or rupees instead of dollars. Every week, American debt grows a little bigger. And somewhere in the middle of all this, decisions are being made that will shape the next 30 years of your life. Japan learned a hard lesson. It thought its wealth made it powerful. It found out that wealth without independence is just borrowed power. It thought its debt holdings gave it leverage. It found out that debt holdings can be a leash, not a weapon. It thought its friendship with America was equal. It found out that the strong define the terms of friendship. And by the time it understood all this, the ink on the Plaza Accord was already dry. China has spent decades studying that lesson. And that is why the past 3 years of quiet selling matters so much. $500 billion is not a small number. It is not a market accident. It is not a random change. It is a message, a slow, calm, calculated message that says, we are not going to be Japan. But the ending of this story has not been written yet. Nobody knows for sure how this all plays out. Maybe China escapes the trap and creates a new financial world. Maybe America adjusts, reforms its debt, and finds a way to keep the dollar strong for another century. Maybe both sides collide and the world enters a new kind of financial Cold War. Or maybe the real shock comes from somewhere else entirely, from a country we are not even watching, from a currency we are not even talking about. What is certain is this: the rules of the game are changing. The old assumption that the dollar is untouchable, that American debt is risk-free, is quietly being challenged. The people who understand this shift, the ones who take it seriously, are the ones who will be prepared, no matter what direction history moves in next. So the next time you hear a small news headline about China reducing its treasury holdings, do not scroll past it. Remember what a single meeting did to Japan in 1985. Remember how a piece of paper, a few signatures, and a shift in currency values erased 3 decades of Japanese growth. Remember that big changes rarely announce themselves loudly. They usually arrive quietly, in hotel rooms, in reports, in numbers that most people ignore. And by the time everyone is paying attention, the moves have already been made. Japan thought it was in a partnership until it realized it was in a trap. China refuses to make the same mistake, and America is now standing in a strange position. The world is quietly asking a dangerous question. What if we stopped playing by your rules? What if the next Plaza Accord never gets signed because nobody shows up to the table? That is the world we are stepping into. Not a world of loud crashes, but of quiet shifts. Not a world of dramatic wars, but of silent exits. Not a world where one meeting can crush a giant, but a world where giants are learning, one lesson at a time, to walk away before the meeting is ever called. And whether we are ready or not, whether we understand it or not, the story is unfolding right in front of us. All we have to do is watch closely, think deeply, and refuse to be the ones who only understand history after it is already too late.